Hello, my name is Elijah Harris, and today I will be reviewing the book The Origins of the Cuban Revolution by Samuel Farber. Farber is a Cuban-born professor of political science at Brooklyn College and has written several books on Cuba. His study and knowledge of Cuban history and politics allows him to give insight to this subject that others perhaps had not considered. The Cuban Revolution has led to one of the longest-lasting regimes in recent history. The revolution and the rise in power of Fidel Castro are important events in more than just Cuban history. The changes within this country radically altered its relationship with the United States and other nations. Also, Cuba's relationship with the Soviet Union, along with its geographical location, nearly brought the two most powerful nations in the world at that time to war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in late 1962. Before getting into the content of the book, I would like to briefly comment on its setup. Oftentimes in historical study, content is ordered chronologically to have events described in the order they occurred. Even though this book does mention some events chronologically to give context to related events, it is generally arranged in more of a topical form. This makes it much easier to understand the various aspects Farber describes throughout the book. An example of this topical arrangement would be the 5 chapters of the book itself. The first chapter is about the Cuban economy before the revolution. The second is about Fidel Castro and Cuban populism. The third is about U.S. policy in relation to the Cuban Revolution. The fourth is about the driving force of the Cuban Revolution. And the fifth and final chapter is about the Soviet Union's relationship with communist Cuba. To break down these topics even further, Farber added subtopics within each chapter. This allows for quick reference to look back on the book and re-examine certain areas. Now I would like to comment on the book's content. Just the same as most other events in history, an important part of understanding the Cuban Revolution is to understand the related events that preceded it. This book serves as a great source for understanding the events that led to the revolution in Cuba that allowed Fidel Castro to come into power. Farber argues in this book that Cuba's economy and politics during the first half of the 20th century were a major factor in creating the desire for radical social and economic change within Cuba. Fidel Castro was able to use this desire for change as a way to appeal to the people and increase his influence. One thing that Farber is careful to point out is that the overthrow of Fulgencio Batista on January 1, 1959, and the rise of Fidel Castro did not signal the end of the Cuban Revolution. In a sense, it was really just the beginning of it. It was not until Castro came into power that many of the changes that were instituted in Cuba occurred. Examples of this would be the Agrarian Reform Law in May of 1959, or Castro creating full diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union while expropriating U.S.-owned property in Cuba. Farber introduces the first chapter of the book by posing a question about the strength of Cuba's economy. He writes, quote, "Did the economic conditions prevailing in Cuba during the 1950s encourage the development of a political climate conducive to a radical social revolution?" End quote. This question can be difficult to answer. Farber points out that the World Depression that occurred during the 1930s devastated the Cuban economy, but its economy had improved by the revolution of 1959. He states that in 1959, Cuba had the 4th highest income among Latin American nations and ranked 31st among all nations. This does raise questions about Cuba's need for economic change, but it is also important to remember that income alone is not always a reliable indicator of economic development in general. Instead of focusing on income, Farber looks more into other factors of Cuba's economic problems. The two largest economic factors that Farber investigates in the first chapter of this book are Cuba's dependence on the sugar industry and the uneven development throughout Cuba. Cuba's sugar industry saw a relative decline through the 1940s and 1950s. Farber states that, quote, "The overall lack of technical improvements and significant new capital investments led to a situation in which Cuba, although the leading producer and exporter of sugar, came to lag behind almost all of the main sugar cane producing countries in cane yield." End quote. This led to a situation where the largest and most profitable cash crop for Cuba was declining and falling behind other sugar-producing countries. Upon moving to the second chapter of this book, Farber explains how the economic problems of Cuba eventually led to populism and Fidel Castro's leadership. He states that, quote, the Cuban economy's problems had helped to create a widespread sense of popular dissatisfaction and frustration that made a large majority of the population potentially open to supporting radical solutions to Cuban problems, end quote. This mentality among many Cubans is what allowed Castro to appeal to the people and gain popularity. Farber points out that it is still unclear what Castro's political ideology was before he came to power. Castro claims that he had been strongly influenced by Marxism and Leninism before coming to power, but Farber questions whether or not this is an attempt by Castro to legitimize his later ties to communist nations. If this is found to not be true, then the argument could be made that Castro possibly altered his political beliefs to what he believed would be the most appealing to the population. It appears that this is Farber's thoughts concerning Castro. He writes, quote, Fidel Castro's politics and methods succeeded in the sense that they enabled him to seize and maintain power in Cuba. Central to Castro's functioning was manipulating people and hiding his political agenda with the purpose of dividing and conquering his actual and potential opponents, end quote. In the third chapter of this book, Farber continues with the idea that more factors were likely involved in the political move to communism in Cuba. Farber presents the idea that some have about external pressures pushing Cuba into communism. The most likely external pressure was the United States' opposition to Cuba's new revolutionary government. He states that, quote, for a long time, the predominant view among liberals and many leftists has been that U.S. Cold War foreign policy during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations was responsible for pushing Fidel Castro and his government into the arms of the Soviet Union and communism, end quote. However, others believe that Cuba would have likely turned to communism without the foreign policy stance of the United States, but also believe that U.S. policy may have sped up this transition in a limited way. Farber follows more toward the second argument and believes that these leaders were actors greatly influenced by their own political predispositions and ideological inclinations. Farber continues this chapter by describing the decline and eventual break in the relationship of the United States and Cuba. The U.S. was not completely against Castro from the beginning. When Castro visited the United States in April of 1959, just 3 months after overthrowing Batista, he was able to gain support and a sort of friendship among some members of Congress. Castro spoke with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during his visit and denied having any connections with communism. This, of course, was later found to not be true. The relationship between these two nations dissolved until it was officially broken in 1961 under the Kennedy administration. In Chapter 4, Farber raises the question of whether the driving force behind the Cuban Revolution came from above or below. In other words, was the revolution pushed by the Cuban leaders or the people? Farber believes that Castro and his government played a major part in the Cuban Revolution. He states that Batista's dictatorship would have likely collapsed without Castro's intervention, but his, quote, political leadership made an even greater difference in determining the course taken by the Cuban Revolution after it came to power, end quote. He mentions on several occasions how Castro's actions helped to revolutionize Cuba. Farber is quick to mention, though, that whatever revolutionary actions Castro took, he was always sure to not take any steps that would leave his leadership role unprotected. Even though he made many revolutionary changes in Cuba, Castro always made sure that he maintained control in anything he did. Farber states that, quote, the control achieved by Fidel Castro became a critical element in the development of a revolutionary process in which the revolutionary leadership always retained political initiative and control, end quote. In the fifth and final chapter of Farber's book, the role of the Soviet Union in Cuba's transition to communism is addressed. The way that Farber describes it, it appears to almost be ironic for Cuba to accept communism from Soviet Union efforts. Even though the Soviet Union began shifting its foreign policy towards third world nations, it, quote, placed a much higher priority on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East than on Latin America. This region was not only far away from the Soviet Union, but, most important, was located in the U.S. backyard and was therefore considered part of the U.S. geopolitical sphere of influence, end quote. Even though the Soviet Union did not completely ignore Latin America, it raises the question of how likely Cuba would have been to accept communism if Fidel Castro and his Marxist and Leninist beliefs had not come to power. The Soviet Union seemed to pay little attention to Cuba under Batista, so perhaps it was not as much Castro as it was a leadership change in general, or possibly a combination of the two. It is difficult to find a clear answer to this question, as well as many others surrounding this subject. Perhaps an answer will be found in the future when Castro and his followers are gone from the picture in Cuba. Until that time, we can only speculate what ultimately led to the rise of Fidel Castro and communism in Cuba. Thank you.